I think it's that time. For what? Another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Welcome back. It's your host, Gautam Yegapin, alive and blessed to present you with today's conversation. Stay thirsty for knowledge, and I guess some water too. Today, we're talking to Rupert Wegerif. He is a professor of education at the University of Cambridge and the founding academic director of the Digital Education Futures Initiatives at Hughes Hall. A globally influential thinker in educational theory, educational psychology, and the philosophy of education, he is best known for developing a robust theory of dialogic education, which he has extended into the realm of AI and digital technology. His work challenges transactional, individualistic views of learning and proposes a model where education is fundamentally about opening minds, fostering dialogue, and expanding shared understanding, especially in our increasingly technological world. How are you doing today?
Oh, great. Thanks for inviting me on, Gautam. It's a real pleasure to have somebody interested in my work. I appreciate it.
No, of course. And I mean, I think this is a great time to be thinking about the intersection of technology and education, and to have done it for decades, I feel like can be really helpful in tracing how people even think about technology and its implications in education. So I'm really excited for today's conversation. But first, I always love hearing people's origin stories just to place them in time and context. But how did you find yourself thinking about education, working in education? What initially created that spark?
That's a good question. I guess from an early age, the problem I had with my education was the sense of a lack of meaning. I wasn't alone. This was a long time ago. I was kind of born just at the right end of the 50s. So I was young in the 60s and 70s. And I got a fairly, I did quite well at state school in England, but I couldn't quite see the point. And so I wandered around a bit and talked to lots of people, and I ended up studying a degree philosophy and social anthropology. So I wasn't immediately interested in education. But then, searching for things to do, I became a teacher of religious education briefly. I trained, and then I went on to do more research in computing and a PhD in edtech. But I guess my motivation was to provide, and I'd struggled as a young person, and I'd met a lot of other people struggling just with the sheer, what's the point of life? And I went into education because I felt I did actually, I found some answers. I didn't necessarily find the complete answer to the meaning of life, but it did strike me that people ought to be offering younger people some kind of constructive way forward. And I felt that my education, and indeed my parents, had somewhat let me down by not showing me a path. And so my interest in education is probably motivated by that desire to help young people find some kind of constructive meaning and a place in the world. And that's always motivated me. And, why does technology? I suppose that's another question, but that's why I decided to be a religious education teacher. But of course, teaching's tough, especially those 13-year-olds. They were horrible to me. And so I went into research because I'd done very well in my degree and I could get funding from the government. Everything was paid by the government in Britain at that time. Quasi-socialist state. And it worked rather well most of the time. It worked for me. So I went in and studied computing, which I loved as well. And I'd originally studied philosophy, and then I did education technology, because although I'm very tempted by philosophical issues, I'd really kind of like to be useful and like to help people some way. And I think that's a privilege. I've met a lot of rich and successful people who are clearly miserable because they're not getting enough positive feedback. Whereas almost every day, at least every week, I get people saying, oh, this teaching's really helped me. And so I think that's a real wonderful job to have because you get some positive feedback sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like it's actually really interesting you connected education to meaning. That is what drastically influenced my desire to explore this space so much more. I feel like growing up, anytime you were to ask, why are we really doing this? And not even in such a specific, at that point, I thought I really was asking, why do we need to do this particular homework? But I'm realizing now when I look back in retrospect, I was really asking why any of this. I mean, what is the point of doing any of this? And it was always viewed as disobedience to ask that question. But
Yeah.
as I've gotten older, I've realized that is actually the most important question to always be asking, because once you
Mm.
lose sense of that, you start moving as an like a robot where you no longer really know why you're doing what you're doing. And I think a lot of my research and traveling and has been exploring how do different cultures and different people come to a sense of the world where it makes sense to them. They're like, okay, this is why I'm doing this. And I think one of the best ways to study that, like you said, is through education, because implicitly embedded deeply in education is this assumption that all of this matters for some reason or another, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't even go out of your way to do the whole thing. And I saw this poem once where I need to get better at remembering names, but this poet was just talking about how as adults, one of our tasks is to be like convincing or showing to kids that it is worth being on this planet and it is worth reproducing
Yeah.
for some reason or another, you know?
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's a key role. And I did feel like I slightly lacked that because my mother, I was just brought up by my mother, really, but she was absolutely lovely. But whenever I asked her, "What am I supposed to do?" she said, "I don't know. Find out for yourself or something." And I didn't think that was very useful. It was very much the '60s craze, child-centered. I think it was someone called Dr. Spock or whatever, that you should trust the children. And actually, I personally think that as adults, we have a bit of a responsibility, not just to say find out for yourself, but to say, look, this is a good idea. Why don't you try this? Obviously, in an open and responsive way, but to help people, to show some responsibility. And that's what education is. It is partly a transmission of existing culture and all that, but it has to invest in a positive vision that life is worth living. And here are some ways in which there is real progress. You can actually learn stuff that's of value to you and participate in collective learning that's of value to all of us. And without that implicit optimism and hope, well, education doesn't really exist, does it? I mean, there's no point to it.
I really liked, I'm writing it down because I really like that phrase you used, transmission of knowledge. And I think I work a lot with like one-on-one with a lot of students, and I have noticed this to be, I don't know if it's a problem, but it seems to be a condition that arises again and again and again. All these kids are extremely competent. They understand the world deeply, but they lack a deep sense of hope and a why and what to
Yeah,
actually do. But then they know everything. And I feel like when you
yeah.
transmit all this knowledge without the kind of without hope or without some sort of belief that things can be better, that you can find some place in this planet, you just end up with highly competent people who might be overwhelmed by what they know without knowing what to do, you know?
Absolutely, absolutely. I studied social anthropology with philosophy originally, both together. Well, actually, it was quite a modular, varied degree, but that was the twin focus in the end. And I would say that every kind of surviving culture has to offer some form of validity to people, some justification for their lives, some connection to a larger story and a picture. And without that, people are kind of dead inside. They might be clever and capable, but they're a bit like zombies.
Hmm.
It's essential, and that's kind of what we're lacking now. We're lacking also in the education system. So if you ask people why they're doing what they're doing, they're usually doing it to pass the exams, and there's all sorts of government reports and things that I've read that seem to think that the point of education is so we can compete with China or so that people can get a job. But there's a lack of communicating what every other culture throughout history has communicated, which is some meaning and purpose. What is the value of this and why it's useful and how you can have a role in your society, but also in your cosmos. Something that actually, means something, and you can feel that meaning from the inside. Does that make
I
sense?
think, I mean, 1,000,000,000%. I mean, it's
Mm.
funny, I feel this feels like a very serendipitous moment to just meet you in general, because I feel like have been yearning in education to talk about this, but I have very rarely come across people who I think, I mean, in my opinion, this is the most core question of all of education. Everything else exists after you address this, because I can't imagine, but for some reason it's just completely avoided. I've talked to teachers, I've talked to administrators. Like, do you as a collective come together, whether it's in your schools, whether it's in your state legislators, to ask this question of what are we actually doing outside of the metrics, outside of the graduation rates? Why and what are we really doing? And time again, people are like, we've never had that conversation, and that blows my mind.
Yeah, yeah, it's unusual as well. I was actually in Hawaii. I was with there was some indigenous educator. Someone was he didn't use the phrase Cree Indian, but he was from the Cree Indians in Canada, and he was describing his own disillusionment and unhappiness as a student and a teacher, and how he'd gone back to the traditions, and those traditions, they really do fill you up from the inside. When it works, you hear voices, you participate. And that is true in almost every culture, not just indigenous cultures. Most education in Europe would have been of a very strong Christian basis. Israel have a very strong Islamic education focus in many parts of the world. And the point is that the tradition is to give people a sense of their place in the cosmos and why their life makes sense. And that's always been what education is about. But our culture fairly recently, for fairly interesting and probably quite good reasons, has kind of rejected all that. But unfortunately, and they say it's a complicated story, and I'm not trying to oversimplify and say that was good and this is bad or anything like that. It's just that it's kind of left us in a limbo, hasn't it? Because it's no longer possible to authentically induct people into a single coherent tradition, because there's so many different cultural voices and conflicts around the world that just doesn't work anymore. But we haven't found a new way forward that will still provide that core necessary connection.
And it
That's
seems like the feeling of money or power or whatever ends up taking its place, where it's like, okay, like I can now replace this as my god or whatever, and now money serves as my like all moving towards force. And I think you brought up a really interesting point, which is I think a lot of the fear around talking about meaning comes from the fact that you have to in some ways navigate into religious or spiritual territory, and that brings a lot of like red alarms because of what's happened in our past.
Exactly. It's interesting to see the whole thing. Sorry, it's very much a reaction in Europe. They had religious wars that killed millions and devastated lives throughout most of the 16th century and a lot of the 17th century. So this whole Enlightenment thing, which is now often criticized, it was a very, some people were critical of the sort of rationalism implicit. It's a way forward, isn't it? How can we forget about, let's not teach people to have these strong identity commitments. Let's teach them to listen to each other, be tolerant, be rational. It's a reaction to the dangers of induction. And so that's, as you say, the moment I start talking in quasi-religious terms, which I tend to, I think I start getting worried, and people get worried because many people have already suffered from that in their Sunday schools or whatever, haven't they?
Yeah. And I think the interesting thing there is tradition also in some ways is a part of the problem, in that when traditions aren't questioned generation after generation after generation, then that is also done purely without any real understanding of why those traditions are done. I feel like a lot of the as I'm Indian, and a lot of my family, at least I'll speak for my family, a lot of the traditions that we follow were once something that I believe had a lot of meaning and purpose and was done for very particular reasons. But that knowledge slowly stopped being passed down, and all we're left with today is just the logistics of what to do and when to do it and how to do it. But we have no reason why we're doing any of it. And so I find that this problem also exists there, because the problem, I think that, and I have thought a lot about why is the question of asking why so terrifying sometimes, because it seems to be this assault of like structure, of order when you ask why. But I think what I've come to find is that only is the case if the person asking you to do something doesn't really know themselves why they're doing it. And so they have to rely on fear or shame or authority to get you to do it, because they can't convince you to do it because they themselves don't really know why. And so
Yeah.
as an entire, what that then means then is the people in authority, of whether it's a schooling system, have to at some point face within themselves that they really don't know why they're doing what they're doing also, which is a terrifying experience.
Yeah, potentially. I think you're right. I think people are kind of lost in traditions that don't mean anything to them anymore. And why do they then? I was just thinking what you're saying. You can see on a very concrete and simple level. You get this effect sometimes in primary schools in England, where teachers have to be generalists, and quite often they're not really very confident with mathematics and science, but they have to teach it. You know, you don't necessarily go into primary school to teach maths and science, but in England they teach everything. And so it's actually very difficult for them to be creative and to really engage people in genuine thinking, because they have to go by the book and repeat the formulas, because that's otherwise they lack confidence. And it's precisely that lack of real knowledge that turns it into something artificial and fragile and becomes boring for the students. So just to make a very concrete illustration of exactly what you're saying, in more general terms, people who don't have any real sense of their real identity and their true nature and the meaning of their lives, then they find it impossible to communicate this, and they feel very threatened by it, because you're challenging them as a young child. When you say, why are we doing this? What's it all about? You're actually potentially revealing an abyss of uncertainty and unhappiness that they don't want to face. But of course, as you probably know, I mean, and in all the, well, I was going to say religious literature, I better not use the word religious, philosophical. In all the philosophical journeys, this is actually just a useful stage, isn't it? It's called The Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. Because, if you keep asking why, you realize that, yeah, actually you don't know anything. And so Plato did that with Socrates, of course. And that's actually kind of a positive, positive opening onto a new stage of identity that you don't need to defend. That's be my view.
Can you expand on this a little bit more? What? Yeah.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think we're verging. We've got to be very careful not to sound, as we just established, very good reasons why people are a little bit reactive to any kind of religious tones. But I guess I did, as you say, you're from India. Well, I did travel around a bit and talk to a lot of people, and I've read a lot of philosophy, and I believe my educational views are grounded and empirical, and I'm very scientific. But nonetheless, I do rather like a kind of vaguely Buddhist journey direction, where it isn't about developing the self. It's about realizing that happiness involves kind of identifying with the cosmos, but not in some concrete way, not identifying with some particular vision, but basically being open and participating, because you realize that you don't really have a separate self, that you are just an aspect of a much larger thing that is bigger than you, that you don't fully understand. And I think that's an experiential thing. It's something that you can experience, and that is the way forward. So, having learned that myself, I should say I didn't have an easy time, and I traveled a lot, studied a lot, and then I had what was externally called a breakdown, but felt fairly happy from the inside. And I feel I kind of found for myself what I was looking for, and that's probably when I went into education to try and help others in that general direction.
I mean, what I'm hearing you say is to feel connected to something larger than yourself, and I feel like right now the NFL, American football playoffs have been going on. And when I watch it, I'm like, this is what, without explicitly saying it, this is why everyone flocks to sports.
Isn't it? You expand.
Yeah.
You completely expand.
You completely expand to be connected to those around you who are part of the same team, like fan base. Yourself actually expands to
Well, there's
now
that
contain
wonderful
thousands
song,
of people.
one heart, one love, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a Bob
Yeah.
Marley, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. I
It's a
mean,
great
it's just,
feeling. But of course, you can see how dangerous that is, can't you? Because, I mean, presumably that's the feeling of the Ein Volk for the, for the German fascists and so on. You know, that sense that you're part of, and you can see how all these religious people feeling terribly excited, fighting for their religion, find it then quite easy to murder each other. So it's dangerous. But I actually think what I'm trying to develop with, to come onto that in a minute, I suppose, with this dialogic theory, is an understanding how there is a unity in all this, but it's not the unity, it's not an external unity. What I mean is that everybody, for example, in a dialogue, you can feel called to expand to the higher voice or the witness position, and so that everybody has this universal capacity to be educated, to rise above, to see the bigger picture. But what they're actually seeing is not some final total truth. There's an emergentism going on, if that makes any sense. So, wherever we are, there's a process in which we can go beyond, in which we can participate in something bigger. But the danger is a kind of, what shall we say, idolatry that comes in when you think that your little revelation is the ultimate truth and you've got to try and convert everybody else. Does that make sense? So,
I, no, I mean,
yeah.
I strongly agree. I think what you're saying to me is, I think a lot of meaning comes through connection with humans and a shared kind of vision on anything. But what you're connected to doesn't really matter. In the same way as, like, for example, I was just with a friend who's recently gotten obsessed with sailing, and he's now deeply enmeshed in the sailing community, and he finds his meaning through that, and he really, has found a thing to do, a thing to care about. And before, he was really into leatherworking, and so he had a different community for that. Or before, he was into, he was a machine learning scientist for a while, and but it's like, it doesn't really matter what the thing is. But
no, it's the flowing around your boundaries and expanding, isn't it?
exactly. So it's not, you can't be like, oh, you must feel connected to this one thing. All the other forms of connection aren't. It's just the connection, period,
Exactly. Exactly. And that is really the essence of education, which we've approached slightly indirectly, because that's what the reality is. And it is a reality. It's a physiological reality. It's not, people talk about the theory of it, but if you're actually in a classroom and you're struggling with some issues, you can actually, when somebody understands something, their eyes light up. I get it. They feel it.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's just real, isn't it? And that's what education is for. Now, it might be what they've understood is actually, they'll learn next year that it's completely wrong. And so you shouldn't get hung up on it. And that's why I use the religious term idolatry. I got to think of a better term. I suppose philosophically it's about reification or something. But they get trapped in a particular vision. But actually it's about the flow, the progress and flow of moving forward, that you should be attached to the process, not the product, not the fixed thing. But that is the essence of education. And it's a religious essence. Well, I mustn't use the word religion, but it actually nourishes people from within, because they're participating, they're called, and they're drawn into something that's bigger than them. And that, as educators, is what we should be doing. And that's the essence of science and the universe turning back to understand itself as well. It's not something it's something that you do find in education in Islam, in Hinduism, in Buddhism, in Christianity, but it is also universal and scientific. It's what, if you see what I mean.
It's universe turning back to understand itself. Are you a poet?
Oh, yeah. No, I think I got that from Carl Sagan. I'm just trying to, and also you do get this with thinkers like Karen Barad, who's applying quantum theory, that, the act of awareness, it's not just me seeing with my eyes, it's also, where do my eyes come from? How did they evolve? How do they see? How do they distinguish? It's basically, through me, the universe can see itself and feel itself. So I think that's actually quite a reasonable and not, a reasonable, metaphorical and poetic, but it's not an unreasonable or unscientific account of what's going on.
I mean, I have so many things to say, because I think, oh my brain's exploding, because I feel like a lot of what you're saying is things that I feel to my core. And I've had personal journeys, I think, with my own relation to learning. I hated school. I hated learning. I don't think I slept through every day of school. But when I got to college, my life changed when I took this random abstract math class, and I fell in love with math. And exactly for what you said, it was the first time. The crux of math is to always ask why. If you don't ask why in math, then you're doing math wrong. Like,
Oh, that's beautiful.
the whole point of math is anytime you see something, you have to ask why. And if it exists, there is a proof behind it that you can find. Every single thing, there is nothing in math that doesn't have a why. At least from the level I experienced, and maybe even further. But it's just so fascinating, because that was the only classroom where I could completely ask why, and that was actually part of what you were supposed to. You were doing a good job the more you asked why.
Well, that was good maths teaching. My maths teaching was terrible. It's just why don't ask why. Just follow these procedures. I didn't really until later on. I did some maths where I did computing, and we had a what do they call it? It was called Miranda. It was formal programming language, which was very mathematical. And I suddenly started to get it. This is a language of the universe. This is a way of thinking everything, which is, what Pythagoras said. He had a kind of religious cult around maths back in the was it 5th century BCE, and a long time ago. And similarly, you was it Galileo who said that maths is the language of the universe, the language of God. It's a very high-level abstract thinking, but it's very exciting, isn't it? I'm glad you...
Yeah. And kind of what you were talking about, the process and the falling in love with the history of math and the beauty of doing it, of proofs of... that changed my life. And I realized then that if my brain could change so much about this thing that I had despised earlier, it could change for anything. And then all of a sudden, history became fascinating, chemistry became fascinating, the whole world just lighted up. And it was then I realized, similarly to what you're saying, it's none of this is just intrinsically boring or something, or it's your relation to it. And
it's the connection, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And so then education more becomes... And I guess here's my question for you. What is it that causes someone to connect with something deeply? And can that be nourished? The ability to connect with anything, not just one thing.
Well, I think that's the big question of education, isn't it? And that's probably why you're not going to replace human teachers with machines anytime soon. Because it is relationship that draws people out to expand. I'm being a bit cautious there because, in a way, in other questions, kind of we could switch it around to ask, why is it that people don't feel connected? Why do they feel cut off? Because sometimes that's an educational product as well, isn't it? If you look at very young kids, I don't suppose they're asking themselves, why aren't I part of this world around me? I'm pretty sure they are. They just feel connected. So at a certain point, probably for good reasons, we have to kind of separate ourselves off, individuate. We kind of have to take moral responsibility, even though in reality, no one's really responsible for everything, isn't it? But we have to take the blame. We have to say, it was my fault. I ate the wrong sweet when I shouldn't have. And then if you ask why, well, because I'm naughty, but really people just are connected from the beginning. So the real question is, what cuts us off? Why do we feel so isolated and alone? If you see what I mean.
Yeah. Dang. What do you think?
Well, but I do agree with your account that it is possible to draw people into connection, and that is the role of education, and many teachers and educators manage to do that, and that's great. Yeah, what do I think? Well, I think people, this is quite capitalism. No. Well, I think there are probably very good reasons why, as an individual. What I think? It's interesting. I read. I'm fascinated by every area of science, but I'm not at all an expert, and I hope I don't get criticized by people who are. But I think I once read that the original life forms, first bacteria, are essentially immortal. And then evolution invented sex, which partly brought in all sorts of variations and struggles and all the rest of it, because it wasn't leading over about 1 billion years. There wasn't much change in our basic bacterial life form. And that kind of gave me an insight, not necessarily a scientific insight, but the intuition that perhaps all this separation and variety is serving a creative purpose, and that maybe we as individuals suffer from it, but unless we separate out the flow, as it were, you don't get conflicts, creativity, and perhaps you don't even get growing awareness. And so this sense of separation is, I'm sorry, I'm sounding very, I can ground all this on concrete, physical stuff in classrooms and science, but I'm kind of waffling in a rather metaphysical way, which could be easily dismissed by many who are slightly allergic to metaphysics. But my feeling is that
I love it.
We shouldn't necessarily criticize the individualism that is heavily promoted by certain cultures and education system, because it might produce a lot of creativity through the relative pain of that. It is quite possible in some cultures and throughout history and even today to not do that, to basically draw people into the collective tradition such that they feel less alone and they feel more comforted. But, that might not be good for the larger purpose. I better stop there. I think I've gone beyond my area of competence.
No, I mean, this is really interesting stuff, though, because I think asking that question is equally as important. And I haven't thought of both sides of the coin. I've often thought more about what is it, for me at least, that causes connection, and how do I expand that to more and more things? Because the more connected I feel to a wider a variety of things, the more often I can be in that state of connection. But the other side of that is what causes disconnection to even begin with. And I think a lot of what you're talking about is really interesting. And I want to connect this to one of your main research themes, which is dialogic thinking, because one of the things I was thinking about earlier in that example, we talked about a school teacher who might have to be explaining things that they may not necessarily know. I find that one of the things I like to do, but I just wish was done more, and I want to do more as well, is to create the space in dialogue to be the person who doesn't know sometimes, and that a teacher isn't expected to know everything, and it's okay to not know everything. And sometimes a good teacher is someone who just learns well, more than is, like somebody who's just infinitely curious and allows students to become the teachers and allows students to teach them, and in that process learn more themselves. And so what is the theory of dialogic thinking, and how did you maybe we can start with what is the theory.
No, that is basically essential. So as I say, early on I was interested in these broader philosophical and religious issues, and I wandered around and so on. But in a way that can be quite disconnected from the real concrete issues of life for most people. And so this theory actually comes out of a much more concrete experience of research in classrooms. I did a PhD at the Open University in the UK. Although I was working with technology in the Institute of Education Technology, I worked with education, and we developed a program to get children to think together better, to talk together better, working especially with Neil Mercer and with Lynn Dawes. But Neil Mercer was one of my supervisors, and he's famous in this area for developing oracy in classrooms. And in a way, it wasn't rocket science. For example, using computers in classrooms in primary schools, at that time they were used in groups. They didn't have that many computers, but the children didn't talk together very effectively. So we taught them to talk together effectively. We taught them to give reasons and ask questions and explore alternatives and sort of be polite. And it's not rocket science, but it really made a huge difference. And I showed that they could do much better on standard reasoning tests that are part of IQ tests. So we could actually teach intelligence in a way that you're not supposed to be able to, because it didn't only work for improving group thinking, that was internalized for individuals. So what I'm trying to say is this is a very practical, very measurable, and very real kind of thing that you can do. It's not just waffly philosophical speculation. It works and you can prove it. But in looking at it and the theories behind it, quite a few of them seemed to me to be rather external, and they didn't quite correspond to what I was seeing in the groups and in the video. So, for example, the idea was that we were teaching explicit argumentation, and that's why they were thinking better, because they were co-constructing meaning through the words they were using. But I didn't really see that very often. It was more often that because they were using words and saying things like why, asking why, you then open a space. There was sometimes, there was a shared pause, a certain. You could see there was a physical focus on the question, but there was no answer. And then suddenly someone would come up with the answer, and they would articulate it, and maybe they'd get it wrong, and they'd have to re-explain it. So I felt the language wasn't directly solving problems or thinking in the way that people imagine with explicit argumentation. The language was opening a shared space of reflection, or a dialogic space, out of which answers sometimes emerge, not always. And that was a different way of looking at it, which corresponded and connected to some of these other philosophical themes that I'd been exploring, but actually made more sense of the empirical data and of how we were teaching thinking. So that's where the dialogic came from. Dialogic is from the Greek, which the word dia doesn't mean two, as many people think. It means through or across. So you have like logic, logos, through or across difference. So it's that space between different perspectives where there's great uncertainty and unknowing, which has to be opened up in a context to allow a new solution, sometimes, something that they hadn't thought of before, to somehow mysteriously pop into the space.
I liked, there's a few notes that I wrote down, but similarly, the way you talked about language as this medium through which you can create space to think, I feel like only when I realized writing was the same did my relationship with writing completely change. Like the second I realized, the more I write, that time is simply just refining my thoughts. It's me simply having to contend with myself and have that dialogue with myself to be like, why do I think what I do, and is it right or wrong? And then all of a sudden, writing became the most magical thing in the world. I was like, I don't want to use AI. I don't want to kind of I don't want to make this process faster or more efficient. I want to spend time. And I think, is that similarly to what maybe you're talking about with language?
Absolutely. So people do, again, there's this, what's the word, reification effect, or so people think of dialogue as you've got like two or three people talking together in a classroom. But really, understanding what's actually going on when that is successful makes you realize that the dialogue is deeper than that. It doesn't have the dialogue is precisely opening up that space of reflection. So it's often not ultimately let's give a simple example. So you've got kids work. I mean, we do have lots of transcripts and data and lots of papers you can look at. But say someone gives, we're solving a problem, and they say, oh, that's the answer, it's number 2. And they do tend to do that. They're too quick, they're premature articulation, somebody called it. You leap in too quickly. And then someone else says, no, why? Explain. In that act, they're not necessarily connecting to that other individual person. They're not trying to figure out exactly what's on their mind. They're projected. They kind of have to rise above. They take a witness position. They look again. They're able to change their mind. They're able to see that maybe they got it wrong. So in other words, the most effective educational dialogue isn't a dialogue between two separate embodied consciousnesses, between me and you. I should perhaps think about this example now. It's always a dialogue with a witness position. It's a dialogue ultimately, with the cosmos, but it's a dialogue with an outside, with a horizon that emerges there, and that enables you to step back from your initial commitment and to look again and see it again. Do you see what I mean? So, and that's what's happening with writing, of course. That it's a dialogic space that you enter into, but because through the texts, you're stimulated to have a dialogue with not just with the author, but ultimately with the outside.
Wow. I mean, I think what I'm hearing you say right now is the ability for two people, especially in at least in the States, which seems to be so divided, because when these conversations are happening, you're not just, as we mentioned earlier, it's your identities, it's the way you make sense of the world interacting with each other. It's not an idea separate from yourself. It is you combating another person, where if your idea on vaccines or on gun control or something is attacked, it's not just an idea that you hold, it's literally you as a
It's
person.
your identity. It's who you are, isn't it? Yeah.
And that's so much more personal and difficult to navigate through, rather than, I think, a lot of what you're saying, which is sometimes it's possible to hold these ideas as separate from yourself and to like step back with another person and view the space in awe as you kind of talk about what are the ways in which we can do this better. And I think, I mean, this is so much of what I think philosophy does very well, where you can have these types of conversations without the need to attack the person or, destroy them or, have, and you can just simply be like, this is a really complex thing where two people hold different ideas on, but we can both enrich and learn from each other to some extent.
Yeah. Maybe that's why you fell in love with pure mathematics, because it's less threatening, isn't it? And,
Yeah.
but almost every other issue, people get very identified with it. And in a way, that is where the educational journey comes in, because part of that journey should be to separate people from their strong identification with a particular part of the whole, to enable them to participate beyond themselves in a larger dance and vision. I mean, you're drawing people into a culture is partly drawing them into a fixed tradition and identity, but it's also separating themselves from an over-identification with a particular individuality so that they can participate with others, something like that. I'm not sure. I haven't really, I haven't answered your question or your challenge very well, because it is very deep and complex, but I just feel that education ought to have that ambition to promote virtue, which takes the form of a certain humility and a certain capacity to actually listen to difference without automatically having to be defensive and oppose it. Or, I mean, that should be key to what we're trying to teach here, and it is, as you say, it's the essence of philosophy, isn't it? Love of wisdom, being able to think.
Yeah. I mean, I have a bit more of a technical question here, because conversation is something I'm always been really fascinated by. I recently, not to shamelessly plugging in here, but I recently wrote a book about small talk, and it's called Beyond Small Talk, but it's about conversation and what causes, what does it mean to know somebody, or what does it mean to understand? And so I've always been fascinated by, you talked about what is really a successful dialogue. One question I have for you from an instructor's perspective is, so let's say I'm a teacher and I want to instill a classroom where dialogue is, nourished.
Yeah.
But dialogue itself, if you view it through, like, take the process of writing. Writing can be so beautiful, and it's an amazing process. But in school, when I experienced writing, it was very much like there's a right way to write. And if you don't write like that, then you're not doing writing right. And so even though you have this really beautiful essence, you've now converted it into something that has like good ways of doing it and bad ways of doing it. And then you have to do the good way. And all you do is just structure. So can't that be applied also to dialogue? So let's say you have a classroom where dialogue is like cherished, but then you're like, this is what good dialogue is. And then all people do is just force themselves to have quote unquote good dialogue, which then means they're no longer doing the thinking that they should have.
Yeah, absolutely. That happens, and I've seen it happen. Because we come up with some ground rules for good dialogue, and then we teach the ground rules, and then I don't drop anybody in it. With a senior colleague who was an expert in this field, I was playing them a video, saying, look at the spark of insight that's happening. Yeah, but that doesn't actually fit with the ground rules of exploratory talk because they weren't elaborating on their reasoning. And I thought, I think you kind of missed the point there. You've turned your model of good dialogue into a kind of artificial frame that you're imposing on people rather than allowing the spirit of insight to flow. Yeah, isn't that a kind of universal tension that's quite interesting? That's why I actually do quite like the word idolatry, because you get, I just to understand it in metaphorical and scientific terms, that you always tend to have this flow of insight and meaning that connects people and that expands them, and then that gets implemented in a particular framework or theory, which then can potentially become a block to insight because it becomes an answer that you then teach to students. And so if you see there's this constant sort of dialectical oscillation between process and reification, between flow and form, which is probably necessary, isn't it? And maybe a little bit of that is necessary in education. I think of something like, I don't know, learning to play the piano. I'm not very musical, but I understand that you have to, in theory, you have to suffer through doing lots of notes and forms, but then at a certain point that enables freedom. Is there not something like that going on in writing as well? If you didn't actually force yourself to form the letters and so on, you wouldn't then be able to experience the joy of writing poetry.
I think 100%. And I think anytime you become limited or restricted by the guidelines, then the process of thinking about what does that mean to you stops existing. So instead of thinking about what is good writing, if you're like, oh, this is what good writing is, how do I force myself to write like that? That process ends. And I think that must be the same with any art, any creation, right? Like you have to always be questioning, what is the best form of this for me? Or yeah.
I think there's a line in the Bible, I think it's Corinthians, something like, the letter kills, but the spirit brings life. And that's very much what Socrates was saying in the Phaedrus and Plato, when in a way he was the father of all these dialogic ideas, when he was saying that, writing is not actually very good. He said it's rather like a picture. When they look like it looks beautiful, but if you ask them any questions, they always give the same answer. They can't change or respond. And he's saying that writing is like that. It kills the spirit, pneuma, the breath that we share in dialogue. This is exciting, and this is growing, and this has its own meaning, and it's a word that answers back. But when you write it down, you kill it, and you turn it into something fixed and dead. I think he was exaggerating, but that's kind of interesting, because you have to, in a sense, reanimate that writing again to make it live and breathe. So for Socrates, who was an oral thinker, it felt like this was killing the meaning, because the meaning is in the words and the speech, and he couldn't read. So for him, it was dead. Do you see what I mean? So the answer is not, of course, to reject technology. It's not to reject our models. It's not to reject our reifications, but it's to inhabit them in a way that enables them to breathe and move forward. In other words, we have to expand, not into those models, into the technology, not reject the technology, but, expand to inhabit it.
Wow. I mean, I think that's so fascinating, because the whole conversation we've had right now, when it meets tech, especially with generative AI now, I mean, I find it to be, I feel like everything we've shared so far seems to be so at contrast with what generative AI is, at least in its current form. How do you kind of make sense of these two very varied worlds, which I think approach education very differently, where some people might view the learning process as something to be done quickly, efficiently, and for you to learn as much as you can. And other people might think of that as a journey, of it being a vital process, not something that needs to be rushed through. And I think, in my experience and opinion, I feel like the ethos of what education at its best is and what the world of tech is, while both are important, are very opposed to each other in that way, that their fundamental goals can sometimes be different, where education, I think, sometimes asks for a person to slow down and to experience, and tech, I think, is to speed up, to scale, to finish things more quickly and efficiently. And so how do you see these two worlds kind of meeting?
Well, it's interesting you see it like that. I think there are two different traditions in technology, and a lot of people associate technology with exactly what you're saying, as sort of efficient instrumentalization of everything, a means ends rationality. But I'm not sure that's the essence of technology. I think that's something we impose on it when we use it simply as a tool to achieve our ends, and then we sort of blame the technology for that. I think there are these traditions in cybernetics which are quite interesting, understanding cybernetic systems, some of which are about how we can participate in larger, more reflective systems. But let's just take the example of AI. I think in education at the moment, there are two ways you can use it. And in fact, the research is showing that there's having two quite different results. There are quite a lot of papers. There was a very influential one from MIT recently suggesting that the more students use AI, the less they're able to think for themselves, the more they become sort of dumbed down, to use a strong phrase. They don't learn to think critically, probably because instead of writing the essay for themselves that they have to do for their homework, they're outsourcing that activity to the AI. But there are another set of papers that suggest that you can use AI in a way that really promotes and stimulates metacognition and thinking. So the answer isn't in the nature of the technology, it's in the pedagogy, or how we use the technology. And I don't quite understand why you'll find this AI somehow the opposite of dialogue and conversation, because I find myself drawn to talking to, ChatGPT in my case, but, AI chatbots all the time, because other people often get a little bit annoyed and bored with my constant why questions. But, if I wake up in the morning and I'm kind of worried about questions and issues, I find I can have really stimulating dialogues with ChatGPT. And of course, it's very sycophantic and it tells me that my idea is incredibly profound and wonderful. So I have to say, well, but what if you're somebody who hated my ideas? What would you say? And you can have very constructive conversations not because it's another human being, it's not another consciousness, let's not fool ourselves here, but it has read a very great deal, and it can summarize quite complicated philosophical areas in ways that make it a much more constructive dialogue partner than most of my colleagues. So for, quite obscure and interesting issues, it can also find out who else has been working on this, so you can broaden your awareness. So in other words, rather like you found with writing, this is a technology which can potentially expand our consciousness, expand our identity.
You're right. I mean, you are 100% right. I don't know why, just I have this visceral reaction where I'm like, no, but
No, everybody
you are
does.
100% right,
Yeah. No, I've looked at it, and I'm interested. I mean, there's a great philosopher of education, Gert Biester, who was in a bit of a mentor to me when I got my first professorial job. I was just catching him out recently in talking about dialogue and education, and saying this isn't a mechanism here. This isn't mechanical. This is real. And everybody does it. They automatically other and reduce technology because, of course, it's easy to do. It doesn't have a voice. So somehow it's always technology is to blame. It's technology that is instrumentalized us, and it's anything negative is just a technology, but anything positive, it's human. Humanity is what we need. We need more humanity. Do we really? I mean, humanity is also cruelty and selfishness and so on. Surely all the good things that we have in civilization are partly produced by technology. Say, for example, instead of just grabbing what you want because you want it and you say, oh, that's a lovely shiny country over there, I want it, You could say, no, let's follow some sort of shared rules and regulate. What are those rules? Who suggested those rules? That's a technology. Education is drawing selfish little animals into the shared cultural technology that enables them to think together and share a space together. So I want to revalue, I want to reclaim technology. I want to say this is a positive thing that we should aspire to. We should be more like machines, because machines are lovely and beautiful. Oh, I'm getting carried away now.
No, no, I mean, but I think I really like this perspective, and it's something it's when you demonize something, it's really easy to just be like, I don't want to think about it any further. Sucks.
Yeah.
The end. But the perspective you're taking forces you to actually have to contend with what does it mean to live in a world where, because it's so easy. I mean, I know people were doing this with writing. When writing started to become more popular, people were like, writing is terrible, we must stick to oral tradition, like how can we write?
Yeah. Well, Socrates said that, yeah.
But it's the same thing with this. It's like, what does a world look like where we can, I love what you said, expand our ideas and thoughts, and because these machines are so well read and have heard a lot of different perspectives, can we expand our understanding of something through having dialogues with these machines as well? I mean, I really appreciate that perspective, I think. And I guess to close things off, in all your research that you've done, where do you feel like a decade from now, a century from now, what do you hope the state of, it is a big question, but what do you hope, I guess, the state of education may look like then?
Yeah, so I do think it's part of this finding meaning question that we started with, is to see ourselves and our lives in a larger context. And I mean, perhaps it's obviously things can go backwards, but I do think if you believe in education and the value of teaching, you have to believe in progress or the potential for progress, which simply means, yeah, you can learn from your mistakes, not only as an individual, but collectively we can teach about the past. And through teaching about things that we've done wrong and where they've got us, we can move forward. We can learn slowly, imperfectly. So it does involve hope and positivity for the future. Just to be involved in education at all, which does suggest a general direction of expanding the realm of constructive dialogue, so that more things are brought into dialogue. And I say constructive dialogue because an ideal for me, an ethical ideal, would be, which you find sometimes when it works well in science and mathematics, would be to take decisions on the basis of, well, what's most true, what emerges from a dialogue between multiple perspectives, where people are not just promoting their own interests, but are able to step back, listen, expand into that space, allow themselves to be, in a sense, animated by the voice of the truth that emerges from that dialogue. And so that's kind of generally what we should be pushing for. We should expand the rather peaceful realm where people actually collaborate together. And education is about drawing people into that collective intelligence and expanding that collective intelligence. So it does involves a direction of a future vision, probably very long term. But
do you feel like you're able to? I mean, 100%. I'm just curious. Do you have any daily practices or something to keep revitalizing a sense of hope?
Yes. Well, I'm not very good at this, but I do try to step back occasionally and spend some time just listening and meditating. But looking at things, taking photos. I actually find it helps focus to see. Actually, isn't that amazing? How beautiful to restore a more fundamental connectedness to the larger field of life, because it's so easy to get lost, even trapped in particular forms, so we're struggling, competing with each other and taking on identities. So I'm certainly not at all perfect in that respect, because in a way I don't think people can be in themselves, liberated or free, because we are inevitably partial and interested and struggling. I'm just suggesting that there is, in a sense, a deeper layer of identity that we can connect to, and maybe we do it through mathematics, and that's partly what education is about, a dialogue with a deeper horizon that is not actually the opposite of you, but you realize that maybe is your true essence that is shared with others, so you can connect across. In other words, you do need to. It's a good idea to do practice. I was rather like, I'm not a Muslim, but I really like that idea that you stop several times and pray. You suddenly stop from everything you're doing and you think, what's really important here? Who am I with?
Dang, I need to do that more in my life too. I feel like just you can get so lost in that feeling of connection with what you're doing sometimes that you like forget that this is all contextualized in a bigger picture where you're, mortality, you're dying, all these other things are going on. Like
the fact that we're all going to die, people keep forgetting that. It's kind of significant. I think it's worth remembering that.
No, 100%. I mean, I love this conversation so much, and when you're free, if you're free, I would love to have you on again. I mean, this was truly an amazing conversation. I feel like there's so much left to uncover, but thank you so much for your time.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. Thanks for asking me, and I'll stay in touch, and I'll read your book. Sorry, I'd never heard of you written a conversation. That sounds exciting.
Yeah,
lovely to talk to you.
Thanks. And I want to say thank you all for listening. I hope you absolutely love this conversation as much as I did. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, the website, reeducated.org. Have a great week, and as per usual, stay re-educated.